Good evening, everyone. Buonasera. Welcome to Casa Italiana and to the Italian department at New York University. My name is Nicola Lucchi. I am the director of the Center for Italian Modern Art, and tonight I am delighted to serve both as a guest and a host for this Neoavantgarde and Cybernetics translation and commentary of Oswald Wiener's Improvement of Central Europe, a novel. This event is part of Colloquium in the Humanities, a lecture series established by Professor Maria Luisa Ardizzone some 15 years ago, with the goal of responding to the marginalization of the humanities and with the mission to re-envision a unitary approach to knowledge, one that not only could open a dialogue between the humanities and science, something that in Italy has been attempted since the 1950s, but to provoke a lively exchange between specific disciplines, one that incorporates the historical perspectives in which these disciplines have come into being and to which they respond. I think we could not find a more appropriate subject than Oswald Wiener for a colloquium that wishes to posit a dialectics between disciplines and forms of knowledge. Wiener is an Austrian intellectual whose book, forgive my German, Die Verbesserung von Mitteleuropa Roman is a meta-literary text that presents a reflection at the crossroads between philosophy of language, cognitive science, experimental literature, and cybernetics. The occasion that makes tonight's presentation possible is the fact that Nicola Cipani, who is a professor here at the Italian department, is the author of a fundamental translation of Wiener's volume in Italian. The translation is right here, published by Edizioni Il Verri in 2021. I call it fundamental because this is the first successful attempt to translate Wiener's book in its entirety and in any language. This has not been translated ever before for a very important volume that is, as I understand, fairly well known within the Germanophone scholarship, but really has not had any way to be appreciated elsewhere. The book has been in part translated. There are fragments of the text that are available in English, but this is the first full translation and therefore merits attention in itself. But Cipani didn't stop with the translation because his volume also includes an extensive corpus of annotations, which make the reading of the book a reasonable proposition, also for someone like me. I am not an expert on Wiener, nor would I have been able to probe the depth of the cultural and historical references that are embedded in the text. And along with these page-by-page textual annotations, Cipani also wrote an illuminating commentary there, Note per la teoria di un romanzo. In fact, this essay is so important that it was published in German. So it's an interesting circular experience here by Ergon Verlag in December of last year. The Betterment of Central Europe, a novel, that's the proper title of the work, is a work of experimental literature for, can we get a raise of hand perhaps of how many people have read this book? Okay, very good. So I will say a few things to precisely try to well, it's very important to understand exactly how critical this text is. Because, so it's experimental literature, which in very broad strokes belongs to the fold of the post-World War II European neo-avant-garde. The 1960s were a time in which the conventions of the novel were once again under attack. We have writers who challenged the linearity of the narrative. They abandoned the single point of view. They abandoned the realism that had characterized an important portion of the works right after World War II. But what comes under attack in this book is not just the traditional novel in terms of content, but also in terms of form. Now, this is a book that violates every possible grammar and typographic convention. It avoids the use of capitalized words, which in German is, bread and butter with the way that German speakers and German writers write. It includes, from the very title of the book, has this annotation, a novel, which is the kind of annotation one leaves to librarians usually. But instead, this idea of categorizing the text from the beginning exposes Wiener's meta-literary attempt from the beginning. And it opens with this extensive analytical index that you see here, which is something that one would usually find at the end of a book. It's an index that goes from well-known individuals like Bergson and Bakunin to the first name Franz, to the word Snoop, to the word Dumbass. The first few pages also illustrate an additional element of subversion of typographic rules, the fact that throughout all of the pages, and as you can see also here in the index, Wiener adopts Roman numerals for the entire book instead of the Arabic numerals. The book then develops through some 130 pages of self-deconstructive fragments and reflections, some with recognizably narrative character, some without. Perhaps I say something stupid here, but it reminded me, as I was trying to read it, a little bit of Nietzsche's writing style, in the sense that, well, first off, there is that filosofia del sospetto, this idea that we're trying to get away at things rather than get to things. And there is a writing that is made of these short, enigmatic passages that build an argument but grant no automatic access to the text. This is not a text that you read and you understand. Not directly, not on the first read. The text in many passages is also arcane and technical, certainly more so than Nietzsche, but in both authors there is a penchant for irony and for the argumentative use of contradiction. One also finds pages of experimental typography, like the one here, and this is a page where the narrative competes with the visual, verbal, and even phonetic qualities of the page. And here I would like to commend Nicola for the translation, because becoming a close reader of these pages also must have meant being able to convey the structural rhythm of the broken syntax, the tentative paragraphs, and the cultural substrate and the tone that underpins the pages. And then one comes across parts of the book that are enjoyable and fully narrative, such as this one, titled Purim, a text for a stage play that resumes the conventions of traditional narrative, point blank, but violates every possible ethical norm one could imagine, because Purim is a Jewish holiday, right, that is traditionally celebrated with masquerades, and often Jewish communities also organize satirical plays that recall the history of salvation that is centered on the holiday. And now Wiener's idea of a theatrical play for Purim is an orgy of violence that a group of actors must perform on the audience of the play itself. Actors are instructed by the script to look for specific types that look like Austrian politicians and public figures, and they must beat them and humiliate them senselessly for the duration of the play. So, if I can make an example, find someone that looks like a communist and percuotilo alla follia, like beat him senselessly. Like it's quite absurd, the whole experiment. And what I find very interesting here is, besides the cynical sarcasm, is the fact that when Wiener resorts to traditional forms of linguistic expression, he does it on stage. As if, this is meant to be a play that, if not carried out in real life, it's something that can be conceived as a mental experiment, but that's where we relegate language to this confined world of the stage, and we stage it in a sense. And I found that interesting. And it's a portion of the book that was, again, very enjoyable thanks to the translation, and it reminded me of Robert Weschler's book on poetic translation, which is titled Performing Without a Stage. And in many ways, I find that Purim serves both as a stage for the performance of language that Wiener conjures as a philosopher of language and theatrical impresario in this moment, but also a stage for the linguistic gusto of Nicola that shines in the fidelity to the surreal atmosphere of this Clockwork Orange-like experiment. And the text then concludes with a series of appendixes, one of which is dedicated to the concept of a bioadapter. The annotations come, of course, before the appendix itself, and they have footnotes, and then they have footnotes of footnotes, again, typical of the kind of chaos that is really the overarching. Perhaps it's not chaos, but it was very hard, believe me, to try and make sense of it. It's non-digestible, precisely. But you do get to the bioadapter. And it's a section that left me stunned, because I found that today's conversation on artificial intelligence, on the idea of a metaverse where all of our experiences will be mediated one day and filtered through the recourse to virtual reality, were in fact at the center of Wiener's reflection already in the 1960s. As conceived by Wiener, the bioadapter is a device in which humans would willingly enter, and once surrounded by this cybernetic apparatus, which is described as a sort of a late-stage computerized uterus, which is capable of sustaining biological life and to equip the individual with capabilities that go beyond the poor instruments of logic and of language and of nerves that we have. Once you're inside this bioadapter, human senses become stimulated by these artificial impulses that are sensorial, but in the first place, and that's what I find interesting, linguistic. So the machine can tell you things, and then the sensation doesn't even have to be all of that precise, because language can falsify so much that it does a lot of the trick of the imagination, and it rules the way you will then have even perceptions, it seems, or at least that's what I understood. I thought that that's interesting, also from the way that these days, something like ChatGPT uses precisely this. Of course, the machine is not really talking to us, and a lot of it is really just computational ways in which things are harvested from the internet, but nevertheless, the attempt is that of having this kind of linguistic interaction, at least on the surface. It's interesting how this caters to the point of to the human being, where the machine at one point can even amputate some of the organs of the individual, the ones that are not necessary anymore. Once you're inside the machine, you're obviously not walking around, so the sensations of walking and the linguistic apparatus of giving the idea of walking can make up for the actual legs, and the legs can be cut. And we get to that point. And the machine, through its feedback loops, which allow for this constant betterment of the performance, direct the path of the individual that, in a sense, becomes to transcend human limits. And is this idea of the cybernetics, from the Greek, Kubernetes is the person who steered the rudder of the boats, right? So you read the signs and you take decisions and you direct the path. And again, that seems to be the way that we are told artificial intelligence one day will be taking us in that direction. I find it ironic that we live in a world where Google Translate has existed since 2006. At that time, it was a statistical machine translation. Since 2016, it's been a neural machine translation. And yet, I think I would certainly dare Google or ChatGPT to translate this book, because I do not think that they cannot even approximate the thickness of Cipani's work, because it's really not just a a page by page or word by word kind of translation, but it's a work that, first off, they have no models to train upon, but besides that, they cannot escape the contradictions that the book makes at every step, and so many other levels of reading that I think there's still a space for human translation, and for a long time. And this book proves it undoubtedly. I don't know where that leaves us, and I want to have more expert persons than me to say things hopefully more intelligent than mine. But what I will like to leave us with is this final page from Wiener's book, where he explains that his hopes for what the readers will take away from the book is the urgency to turn against continuity, contingency, formulae, and anything that is just, that is natural, that is evident. He says that if one wants to have a fleeting experience of the dispiegamento del sé, the unfurling of the self, this idea that the only way in which you will be able to truly flesh out yourself, and at the same time to take in the experience of the world beyond language, is precisely to you have to give up at the expense of the strictures that language imposes, and we must move beyond it to achieve this level of experience. And yet, it is thanks to language that we're here, and thanks to the power of translation that this conversation can still happen. Of course, one thing is communication like this, one thing is philosophy of language, but it's an interesting point, even that. So with that said, I would like to invite to say a few words to Professor Thomas Eder, who we are very happy to have here at NYU for this event. He is a literary scholar who joins us from the Institute for German Studies at the University of Vienna. He has a focus on cognitive poetics, and his research interests include literature and the art of the post-war avant-gardes, the relationship between literature and epistemology, synesthesia and literature, the concept of ekphrasis, and the literature and imagination. He's a widely published scholar and an expert on Oswald Wiener. And of important note is his upcoming publication, which is precisely dedicated to Wiener's theory of thought, conversations and essays on fundamental issues of cognitive science, which is edited by him, by Thomas Raab, and by Michael Schwarz. And it will be published in 2023 by De Gruyter. And it will include 3 conversations with Wiener that must have happened in the past.
2017 to 2019.
Perfect. As well as 3 essays by the editors. So please help me welcome Professor Eder.
So, good evening. Thank you, Nicola, for this kind invitation, for all this doing the groundbreaking work here for tonight. And thanks, Nicola, of course, for doing all the translations and the commentary. I will talk a bit about some aspects in the improvement of Central Europe novel, which I suppose, or which I would call, with a bold claim, I would start that this improvement is maybe the definitive Entwicklungsroman, coming-of-age novel of the second half of the 20th century onwards. On the one hand, it is the document of the authors of Oswald Wiener's intellectual development and how this led to profound changes in his thinking. In this regard, it marks a turning point. On the other hand, it is a diagnostic and prophetic text concerning the socio-historical, political, and scientific movements and developments in the Western world since the 1950s. In itself, the book is extremely heterogeneous. We heard about it. It consists of several very dissimilar and only loosely connected parts, starting with aphorism-like passages, fragmented prose, essays, followed by mock theater plays. There are more of them in it. Alacherim, Epiphanies are saved, Report on the Feast of Concepts is one of the titles. Or Purim, a feast and 2 studies on sitting, in which Wiener's epistemological speculations are given literary form. The 2 closing parts, the essays on the so-called bioadapter, I will return to them. Nevertheless, Wiener has persistently placed the genre designation novel, romancero, in the main title. But the genre designation in the main title can also be seen as an indication of the work's meta-literary character, genres, and with them the possibilities of literature as a whole to address the issues raised in the improvement are critically examined. Nevertheless, the novel form, the form of the novel, remains as a kind of basic framework reduced to a minimum. According to Cipani's study and Cipani's insights, this novel form, the form of the novel, survives Wiener's almost all-demolishing rage. The subject of this rage is an amalgam of analytic philosophy of language. Ludwig Wittgenstein, the towering figure of this philosophy of language, is addressed in sometimes not that nice ways, behaviorism, but also the scientific world conception of logical empiricism and neopositivism, which are tackled and critically tackled here by Wiener. Along this complex, changing, perhaps dialectical relationship to science, and science is natural science. In English, I think it's rather clear, and in German, Wissenschaft is somewhat in between humanities and science, but Wiener always means natural science here, science. Wiener, and thus the improvement as the symptom of it, its symptom, define the relevant path of post-war avant-gardes as a whole. This development addresses the romantic notion that the artist or the writer could oppose science with their works. As such, the improvement can be understood as an argument against the scientific world conception, the de facto power of science. In the course of the 20th century, the effort to oppose to the scientific world conception with an equally consistent non-mechanistic artistic method has gotten insurmountably large. This is a quotation by Thomas Raab on Wiener's development. This insight also identifies the aesthetic design of the improvement as one of the central testimonies of avant-garde literature, even though its author retrospectively assesses it as a poetic artwork committing suicide. Wiener himself, quotation, "By suicide of an artwork, I wanted to drastically emphasize that the author is permanently sawing at the branch he sits on. Each and every sentence is written so that the author undermines, with respect to logic, his own principles. He's pulling away constantly the carpet which he stands on. The suicide of poetic artwork aims at linguistic artwork which despises and denounces language. What is more, in an artistic way. It denounces language in an artistic way. So basically, this isn't possible. It contradicts itself. Wiener's ironic attitude is turned against his own writings, even against the nucleus of romantic art within the avant-gardes. So maybe this is a notion we could discuss upon, this romantic nucleus within the avant-gardes, which was to overcome this mechanically and scientific revolution and hegemony in the 20th century. Through this, the improvement sketches Wiener's development towards becoming, later on, a renegade scientist or a scientific renegade. This is also the tremendous achievement of Cipani's commentary, besides the task, the Herculean task of having translated such a disparate work into Italian, the revealing introductory essay and the commentary explaining passage by passage. The necessity of understanding while translating, of not being able to swindle over passages that are not understood, has meant that Cipani has dug and asked. Dug with his philological accuracy and ingenuity, and asked with his meutic skill, having asked the author of the improvements. In many hours of video conferencing, Wiener and Cipani have jointly traced the first-hand information and authorial intentions in the course of the translation. Of course, Cipani's commentary follows the sequence of the improvement from front to back. He treats the different parts and genres, also asks about their possible coherence principle, which he establishes in the presented and at the same time subverted form of the novel. In my short contribution here, however, I will start out with brief glimpses of the sequence of Cipani's commentary first, and then I will linger a bit at the end of the improvement and the bioadapter, this maybe interwoven concept between neo-avant-garde and cybernetics. A core argument in Cipani's study is that Wiener critically tackles the form of the novel in his improvement. The argument unfolds like this. That's a quotation. I translated it in English from the original Italian to the German, which Cipani did on his own. Now I did with the help of the daughter of Oswald Wiener. The monologuing voice in the sections comprising approximately the first quarter of the novel still belongs to man in revolt, consistently saying no. Here an echo of Albert Camus can be seen, whose Homme révolté declares in uncompromising rejection man's complete and immediate ascent to part of himself. However, while Camus' Homme révolté finds, quotation, Cipani, in revolt the only fundamental certainty as a substitute for a Cartesian cogito and relies on the alternative of either expressing a complete rejection of reality through formalism or further emphasizing its crudeness through realism, Wiener's improvement goes even further. Both formalism and crude reality are unworkable paths for him. The latter because it goes against the political core of reality. The former, and this is now my elaboration of the argument, because the new linguistic devices used in the consummation of literary experimentation, of experimental literature, have been used up in the course of subsequent time and reintegrated into an outmoded artistic practice of expression. That's a quotation of Wiener in retrospect, looking at his phase of being an experimental poet. What was to be feared for tactics has largely already come to pass. In the attempt to mobilize a new sense of meaning, the old sense survives. The same phrases, expressions, and styles that we used provisionally to describe a departure now denote again that whose overcoming they were meant to help initiate. The tool has slipped away. But with this, precisely the claim of the literary experiment after 1945 had become irredeemable, namely to provide a critique of formal theories of communication with the aim of providing the content of point of view as the individualistic one with an arguable theory. Connected with this change of assessment is a reorientation of Wiener, a turning away from art and literature in favor of a turn towards science, even if it is precisely this relationship that is repeatedly critically at stake. There is something like being attracted and repelled by science at the same time in pendulum swings in even higher layers and levels. 4. I continue to quote Cipani, the synthesis of introspection and automata theory, on which Wiener later builds a theory of thought, is clearly prefigured in the improvement by the permanent tension between mentalism and behaviorism, between consciousness and machine, and shows the unchanged need to grasp both the quality and the regularity of mental processes. And here I add a relativizing quotation by Wiener himself, which refers to Cipani, where Wiener reads like this: I do not aim at the synthesis of introspection and automata theory. It is rather about the confrontation. What about the contexts conceived in introspection can be conceived in a reasonably satisfactory way as a realization of contexts within a formal system, for example, the formal system of automata theory? Or the other way round, how well does the model of automata theory, computer metaphor, Herbert Simon's physical symbol systems theory, artificial intelligence at the present level, how well can this capture essential features of human thinking? What would be considered a reasonably satisfactory way here? How much and what does the formal system abstract? Certainly, that's now continued with Cipani's commentary, the author of the improvement had not yet developed a specific practice and terminology. The strongest expression of an intended conquest of the unconscious is left to the supernatural, poetic or counterfactual figure of the archangel. So this is maybe very rather astonishing here that if we're talking about cybernetics and then return to the concept of the archangel. I skip this line of thinking with archangels now and come back to cybernetics. So the improvement is also a piece of philosophy of consciousness, a retreat from the environment into consciousness, but just not only as a dissimulation or hypocrisy. Its basic current in this is the conviction that something in this novel is right without being able to say or show it. For example, the radical conviction that natural science must be fought. One must take care that science is not directed against the ideals that are still there. One must abolish science with all consequences, even if we die in the future from diseases the medicine could cure. Wiener commented on this in an interview that has just gone to press and will appear in this book Nicola mentioned. My opinion about science had stayed the same. I regarded it as a kind of bullshit mimicking the surface of things when fundamentally their depth would be important. Science knew nothing of these depths. On the other hand, I wanted to learn its tools because I wanted to know what I was talking about when I was denouncing it. That's maybe not a bad idea. Furthermore, I was fascinated by the drive of writing the Verbesserung, and I was still touched by experiencing and doing art. So this kind of Ergriffenheit of being touched is very important in all the phases of works for Oswald Wiener's work. With this book, I tried to somehow amalgamate art and science, at least in the sense I understood them then. At the beginning, the poetic elements were much stronger than the rational ones, but this gradually changed during the writing process. In his introductory essay, as well as in his commentary, Nicola deals intensively and extensively with the following thematic blocks, which I won't go into detail now. Language metaphor, the linguistic turn and its slackening, the decline of the linguistic turn, and then as a second aspect, very important, the concept of dandy and dandyism, and the concept of nihilism, and an amalgamated concept of dandyism and nihilism, and then the political aspects in the improvement. This is very worth of talking about. But these different thematic complexes are closely intertwined in the improvement, and thus also, as Nicola Cipani does in his book, by the sections on the so-called bioadapter. These sections, together with their theoretical underpinnings, count as the first sketches of a bliss suite, or the virtual reality, before it was called like that, in which man and machine fuse into a kind of cyborg. Although constantly, ironically, undermining the arguments in this sketch, they express Wiener's opinion that the bioadapter offers the first debatable outlines of a complete resolution of all world problems, which is, of course, here with some kind of irony spoken. Initially, Cipani talks about the bioadapter. The bioadapter simulates reality through external stimuli. Thereupon, it materially connects to the nervous system, resulting in a continuum between machine and consciousness, amputating the various parts of the body that are now largely useless. And now I would, to end my contribution, I would comment a bit on a concept which I find at the core of the idea of the bioadapter, and which maybe has, or I would say it definitely has some kind of possible connections to the discussions we had before on this ChatGPT and so-called artificial intelligence. The sections on the bioadapter are based on the idea of functional equivalence. Even if the author of the improvement was not aware of this concept at the time he wrote it, and probably only implicitly designed it in the bioadapter. Based on metaphors taken from automata theory, functional equivalence refers, on the one hand, to the indistinguishability between the output or behavior of two different entities reacting on the same input or stimulus, for example, of man and machine. On the other hand, an organism may react to two stimuli in the same way, thus making them functionally equivalent. The one, maybe example, if I touch a wooden board or a sandpaper, I have some impression of touching a wooden board or a sandpaper, but you can limit and minimalize these stimuli to some sensations at the nerve endings, or even in the second phase of the bioadapter to some simulations that give you the impression of touching this sandpaper. But functional equivalence can also be interpreted as a behavior indistinguishable to an observer, although generated by two essentially different entities, man versus machine, for instance. In the quotation, may not machines carry out something which ought to be described as thinking, but which is very different from what a man does? This objection is a very strong one, but at least we can say that if, nevertheless, a machine can be constructed to play the imitation game satisfactorily, we need not be troubled by this objection. So this is maybe the starting paragraph of the new Evangelium. It is Alan Turing's 1950 paper on Can Machines Think? And this has become known, the arguments which are unfolded in this paper, of the Turing's test. And Turing seems to be satisfied by the indefinable intuition of functional equivalence at the level of the screen symbols, the three players exchange. To search the program itself for any structural similarities with human thought is thus out of the question. So this is the counterpoint to functional equivalence would be structural equivalence, and this is what Wiener follows up in the direction by demanding that a structural specification instead of functional equivalence as the definition of intelligence have to be brought to the fore. I tried, it's a quotation by Wiener, to specify a task which a machine has to fulfill in order for me to begin to ascribe intelligence to it, to fold strings under constraints. But for Turing's test, not even this would be a reliable criterion. First, even humans do not always succeed in such folding. And second, a benchmark for the difficulty of such tasks for humans and for machines cannot be effectively determined. Therefore, I took one step further and tried something like a structural characterization of my own thinking. Beyond this, I don't know further. If someone would present me with a machine in which I recognize the same processes at work that I find in introspection, then I would just settle down to the opinion that it thinks just like me. Well, this is from 1990. The concept of functional equivalence has the consequence that there is nothing real. Es gibt nichts Echtes. It is comparable to the following passage from Descartes' first meditation, in which he conceives the idea of an evil demon who only fakes all our impressions, perceptions, and experiences. I shall suppose that some malicious, powerful, cunning demon has done all he can to deceive me, rather than this being done by God, who is supremely good and the source of truth. I shall think that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things are merely dreams that the demon has contrived as traps for my judgment. I shall consider myself as having no hands or eyes or flesh or blood or senses, but as having falsely believed that I had all these things. And this is the motto Wiener uses for one of his essays. This also leads to the fact that the I is an illusion, has to ponder about what it can understand and has understood of the organization of its organism. The question arises, which instance is this I? One can even go so far to question at all whether there is an instance which perceives, experiences, and feels. As long as this is not clarified, one can assume that there are very many intermediate stations and states where one can evoke the same feeling at any time without having the whole sensory apparatus available and going through it. The latter is shown, for example, in this passage, and I come to the end, from the bioadapter. The adapter must furthermore be capable in any event of performing all sorts of operations on a body that, initially, is after all still human, amputations, organ transplantations, neurosurgery, and carry out the regeneration of any of its own functions that may be impaired, or design and install replacement modules and, more generally, newly developed components. In other words, it modifies not only its programs, which must be interpreted as command sequences of material states, but also in the course of its self-adaptation, its physical modules, which, as program carriers, are what makes sequential control possible in the first place. In this regard, the latter are no longer in any way passive media of the operation, but in fact determinant states. The distinction between hardware and software is solely didactic, without any substantial basis. The installation of a joint between shoulder and elbow will usher a new era of backwashing. Within Oswald Wiener's work, the bioadapter takes on the role of a radical utopia, which is repeatedly questioned in the phases of his work that follow the time of its writing. This happens in the form of pendulum swings and movements, as I said before, in a kind of dialectic of being attracted and repelled by and through the promises of behaviorism, materialism, and the so-called artificial intelligence, which in its performance and result produces something similar to human intelligence, but is very different from it in the cognitive process and in its phenomenal aspects. With today's seemingly successful processes creating something similar to the bioadapter, these forms of artificial intelligence no longer rely on the acquisition of structure. They achieve the goal set for them by very different means than human intelligence. More strongly, in the direction of a belief in the possibilities of AI, in 1988, Wiener was still rather convinced that there should be that the bioadapter might be possible. My reflections during the past 25 years have led me to the conviction that, in order to correct me, the bioadapter must itself be conscious and willful, maybe experience lust and pain, certainly have appetites and prejudices. Suppose a radical new science would make this possible. How will the bioadapter itself cope with its personality? Will it build its own bioadapter? And how could I, its thalamus, profit from it by a third-order failure? In 2017, however, the author was convinced that efforts in the field of behaviorism and statistics will fail. Although they will be able to replace man, they will do so only by functional equivalence and not in the sense of real man. Machines, on a behavioral and statistical basis, will not have any ideas in the sense of what I call proxy objects, Vorstellungen. It's a complicated word in German and rather hard to translate into English. So it's not the object outside, but it's the object within the brain, or the mind. Yeah, there's much to say about it. They will not experience what I experience when I work to solve a geometric problem, for instance. In fact, they will not experience anything at all, but still they will function. And yet I cannot say, okay, that's enough for me. It simply isn't. At the end of the day, my last excuse when I feel really cornered, my last point of support is that all I really want to know is how I myself think. How does my thinking function? And I'm now convinced that that's not going to be explained by the means of artificial intelligence so far. We have already been living within the bioadapter for a long time. Thus, the section bioadapter ends with a sentence without any period. Maybe we are all. Okay. Thank you.
Maria Luisa, grazie mille per averci tutti qua. We are conjured up thanks to your very, very kind invitation. You've been such a good colleague and friend. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to present this. You don't hear me? No. I'll talk louder. Yes. No, this is not amplifying me, but I'll. Okay. I also should mention, since Nicola has talked about the fact that I translated myself, that I was luckily I had the help of 3 significant revisions by 3 people who know this book very well, who almost grew with it. Sissi Tax is a friend and an experimental writer, and so knows Wiener both as a Germanist, as an experimental writer. She was able to go through my manuscript first, doing a lot of work. Then Thomas Raab, who was just mentioned by Thomas Raeder, and who has been also working with Oswald Wiener in this kind of no man's land between science and literature. And finally, Una Wiener, who is also proficient in Italian and was able to take a look at both and just give me very good insights, sitting down with me on the final German version. I think that reaching this point of the presentation, and thanks to the contribution of Thomas and Nicola, whom I both thank, I don't need to explain to you that this is a very challenging book, right? This book was met right away with a number of perplexed reviews, but it also, and this is an interesting fact, it gained immediate endorsements that noticeably stood out, both for the enthusiasm of the pronouncements. Some declared it outright, just like Thomas did now, but we're talking about when it came out, one of the most important post-war books in German. And also for the kind of people that rallied behind it, not just critics sympathetic to experimentalism, but also writers, artists, also just to name 2 famous people, Joseph Beuys and Peter Handke. They were really strong fans. And in fact, this book has enjoyed to date a continued presence in the public intellectual discourse among German-speaking musicians, artists, writers, a presence that we can trace up to the present day, as I said. And the fact that it was included in the canon wasn't just a matter of, some experts disconnected from readership. The verbesserung, the miglioramento della mitteleuropa, as I called it in Italian, had a remarkable circulation for a radically experimental text, considering its difficulty. It has been reprinted several times. It was circulating at some point in a 20,000 paperback edition. And since today we are talking about the Italian translation, among other things, it's worth mentioning that Italian scholars in the field were also paying attention. In 1973, Einaudi published a collection of essays on the modern German novel. It was called Il romanzo tedesco del Novecento. It's a well-known book among Italian Germanists, and it was curated by notable Italian experts like Baioni, Bevilacqua, Magris, and Cases. So in this book, there were about 40 essays dedicated to as many representative novels in an attempt to sketch a 20th century canon, already when the century wasn't over. It was 1973, right? And so you had like the obvious names like Kafka's Castle, Musil's Man Without Qualities, Franz Werfel, Gottfried Benn, Martin and Robert Walser, Thomas Bernhard, and so on. And you find an essay indeed dedicated to Oswald Wiener's Verbesserung. Claudio Magris, in an article for the journal Itinerari around those years, praised Wiener's book as uno dei romanzi d'avanguardia più ferocemente ardui, un romanzo intraducibile, dottissimo, furibondo, which is, it's a praise that actually foreshadows a difficult reception, arduo, feroce, intraducibile. So the book did in fact discourage critics with its arduousness. It did irritate a few with its ferocity and remained untranslated, which that is largely unknown to an international readership. Quite the exception, by the way, among the other 40 books that were lined up in that Einaudi volume, because all of the other ones were translated, except in Italian and in English, except perhaps another one or so. So more than half a century after its publication, and I'm saying this to kind of justify my effort here, it seemed about time to do something about the still existing gap between the limited but emphatic support achieved by this book. Thomas Eder is one of the very few scholars in the field that has, produced some dedicated essays. There are only 2 monographies dedicated to it, and they are dissertations from over 30 years ago. Over 30 years ago. That's it. And so you have this gap between the support by some critics, the quotability of the book, its official place among the classics of neo-avant-garde experimentalism on the one hand, and then this scarcity of scholarship on the other, and particularly scarcity of textual exegesis. And as a translator, as Thomas and Nicola mentioned, I was I was forced to the proximity with the text. I had to interrogate the text for meaning at every step of the way. So this process is reflected in the commentary I wrote, which conversely provided the roadmap I needed to refine and complete the translation. So for today, we decided to focus on, this book, we focus on cybernetics, and is a whole section of this novel dedicated to a critique of cybernetics. There are several passages which contain remarkable anticipations of present-day effects of the cybernetic paradigm. You've heard about the bioadapter, this thought experiment involving an electronic pod capable of gratifying human hosts with a simulated reality. It's the scenario which later on in the philosophical debate will be known as brains in a vat or a simulation hypothesis. What's impressive in Wiener's technological imagination is not only its foresight, but also really the depth of his reflection on artificiality, its articulation with respect to the complex theoretical and epistemological strands that run through the novel. And I'm here naming a few items very much in passing and quickly, so you feel free to just, if you have questions, we can get to it in the Q&A moment. But basically the machine metaphor is the confluence of the critique of language pursued with caustic vigor in the opening section of the book. The machine is also presented as the peak of a historic trend towards formalization, which pertains not only to the realm of science, formalisms in the proper sense, but affects also everyday life. Also attracted in the orbit of the machine metaphor is his political reflection. For Wiener, cybernetics represents the triumph of state with a capital S. At the individual level, the hard materialism of the machine forces a rethinking of what is meaningful, of, let's say, our way of organizing sense, really. And in his opinion, it also forces some kind of existential retreat of the subject. At least this is how I interpreted this novel. The critique to cybernetics, as you see, takes many aspects. Wiener's acute awareness of the epochal shift brought by computing machines, a reality which then has just begun to emerge, carries a bounty of insightful epistemological intuitions. His bioadapter contains, for instance, a philosophical argument for hedonism. Those of you who are familiar with Robert Nozick, often quoted State, Anarchy and Utopia, know that there is like a brief description of a similar bioadapter-like device, and that is used, however, strangely by today's philosophers of mind as an argument against hedonism. So no, in Wiener, that's the opposite. It also foreshadows an offsetting of Occam's principle of parsimony. So you see, it's a very rich discussion on the machine, and some passages, you've got it from the previous presentations, they really read as if they were written today. We could take them verbatim as critical arguments against the supposed intelligence of current AI systems. So to give an idea of Wiener's nuanced position, I thought, however, it would be best for me to try to explain the reasons for his involvement, his initial involvement with cybernetics. Wiener was working at Olivetti in Austria, in Vienna, as an expert in the field. He became an expert in cybernetics. The book ends with a bibliography, a crazy list of 1,400 books, which represents an attempt to really realign knowledge according to the new paradigm. Also showing Europe, this is kind of this improvement of this lazy Middle Europe, is you have to pay attention to what's happening in America. You cannot be a snob. That's one of the messages of the book. And so this was an early fascination, progressively but not entirely abandoned with time, that with cybernetics. And the bioadapter episode reveals, among other things, Wiener's persuasion that technology is a powerful heuristic tool. heuristic tool. So a machine-produced reality is used here as intuition pump to inquire in the hard philosophical problem of consciousness, to uncover paradoxes and inconsistencies in the way we conceptualize it. So indeed, Wiener looks at techne as a force that under circumstances could upset reality for the better. So this seems to counter a narrative which we are also familiar with. It's been echoed and repeated ad nauseam by so many. So the narrative, of the evil techne, and it's evil. Why? Because it escapes the benevolent tutelage of science and philosophy, who for some reason are good. I don't know why. But here the Weltbild produced by scientific philosophical systems is being strongly questioned. So techne, since it's an agent of change, it's not per se unwelcomed. So, to get more specifically into our topic, Wiener's interest for cybernetics started before he began working on this book, when he was still like a part of this. He was like 20-year-old and was part of this young group of experimental writers and anarchists and enfant terrible of the Vienna scene called Wiener Group, the Group of Vienna. So I will refer both to the novel but also to his previous activity when I talk about his fascination with his early fascination with cybernetics. So let's start with the definition of cybernetics advanced by one of its fathers. This is the more famous Wiener, Norbert Wiener, right? So Norbert Wiener says cybernetics is the science of control and communication in the animal and the machine. This is a bold definition because it boldly classes together communication and control, but also even bolder is the classing together of animal and machine, right? So the organism is just like a steam engine. Huh? It's a self-regulating causal system which controls entropy via feedback. So what makes possible this analogy is a movement in two directions. So there is, on the one side, there is an expansion of physiological concepts such as reflex or homeostasis. They are born in physiology, but then they get into the realm of mechanics. And then vice versa, of course, there is this movement on the other direction, the mechanized notion of the mind as a logical machine, which is born before computer. It starts already with analytic philosophy, because the way that analytic philosophy divides the facts of the world as discrete entities, it atomizes. It's an atomism that then makes it possible for Warren McCulloch to come up with this idea of an idealized neuron that can just operate with these discrete facts. So it's a theory that can forego the specific physical properties of systems. It can claim universal applicability. And here, another famous father of cybernetics, the British cybernetician Gordon Pask, had to confess something. I'm quoting, "This is not a prudent methodology, for it runs the risk of seeming to be impertinent." And, impertinent it was. And by that, I mean not just literally the audacity, with which it presented itself as ultimate method of methods, like a new ars generalis ultima, but also in the full sense of the word, as it gave itself authority on such a disparate, non-pertinent items. So it's impertinent also in the way, it can describe systems in brash disregards of their content. It can go very nonchalantly from the flow of Panama's Canal to the human mind, from the organization of a society, no matter if it's a society of ants or a society of humans, to a remote-controlled missile. You see, so now I think that precisely such bold disregard for scale, for hierarchy, such is kind of an affront to the scala naturae, it could be quite interesting for a young poet. So this poetics of impertinence, one that allows you to look beyond the great and the small, beyond the organic and the inorganic, with the implicit promise of a radical reconfiguration of reality. And to get a sense of that impertinence, you can just take a look at the index pages of cybernetic books, right? Because there is a list of such incongruent items. Here I have Norbert Wiener, The Human Hues of Human Beings, Cable, Calvinism, Canada, cat, see also kitten, Catholicism, cattle, chess, chimpanzee, China, Christianity, Cicero, etc. Then this is not unique. Ross Ashby, famous book, An Introduction to Cybernetics. Those are just canonical books on the field. Cat, again, cat. Cat skidling. What is cat skidling? Cache. Yeah. Chain, Markov chain, of course. Chameleon, channel, chaos, clock, cloud, coffee. And here you saw, Nicola showed you that Oswald Wiener's book, which is all in Roman numerals. So it's a preface to a book that doesn't exist yet. It's a preface to, it starts with the word preface. Some people have misinterpreted this as if it was just the first pages. No, the book is a preface. It's all paratextual. And you see there is this list, and it reads just as those, right? There is a cat even there, but there are scurrilities, etc. So it's actually funny because it presents itself as a list of notable items, but then you realize why they are not notable. There are also stupid things mixed in. And so the message here is really strange. It's almost as if he had tried a vertical disposition of. It's like, when in extensive logic you try to describe a set, you open the parentheses and you list all the items of the set, almost like an extensional description of what is my novel about? Well, my novel is A, B, C, D, just registering these terms almost nonsensically, just caring about the alphabetical disposition with the same type of disregard for content that a cybernetician could have. In fact, when it comes to Stein, and he means Gertrude Stein, he puts her in the same entry of Stein, the stone. There is no difference. Hammer, Detective Hammer is within the same classification of a hammer. So it's like a Pontius Pilatus telling you, I wash my hands. You are the one who read the strings of signs and who attributes meanings to it. In fact, the book starts with a Pilatus quote, O gegrapha, gegrapha, what I've written, which is the Pilatus response to those who asked him to change the INRI inscription. And I want to show you something that Thomas just brought me kindly from Vienna, just to show you this ongoing relationship of artists, of musicians, of not specialists with the book. Every year this happens. Someone last year just did a record with techno music, and it superimposed the reading of this cybernetic index by Wiener in this double LP. But I mean, this is not everything. I mean, there was an anarchist group like a few years ago who reprinted the novel in a bootleg edition and distributed it, just as an artist's gesture, So every year you see still this kind of, a passage of the book becomes the title of an exhibition, or, there is this relationship of artists, at least, if not critics, with the book. So, impertinence. Now, let's come to a second reason for the cybernetic being sexy here. Cybernetics promised also efficacy in the action of control. So I'm giving you another famous definition formulated by Louis Couffignal. La cybernétique est l'art d'assurer l'efficacité de l'action. The art of ensuring the exactitude of action, right? And the authors of the Vienna group, of this kind of young enfant terrible of Viennese scene in the 50s, promoted an anti-expressive poetics. They said that they would favor Eindruck, so the impression caused by their poetry, over Ausdruck, so over expression. So impression instead of expression. So poetry for Oswald Wiener and his friends Gerhard Rühm, Konrad Bayer, should no longer be expression of a self-enunciating lyrical subject, but an exploration of the effects of language on behavior, one's own behavior and the behavior of others. So during performances, the Wiener group experimented both with language and with scenic acoustic experience in order to elicit specific reactions from the audience. The success of a piece was directly related to its intensity as a stimulus and in its ability to condition a response. It's a stimulus-response dynamics with a very strong Pavlovian flavor. Pavlov is fundamental for cybernetics because he gives the basic learning pattern. The Pavlovian scheme, we can elaborate on this later if you want, is not, as some might think, just a simple matter of an automatism that doesn't change. The point of Pavlov is precisely that there is a learning scheme involved in this type of behaviors he studied. So I'm just reading you from an excerpt from the program of the literary cabaret held by the Vienna group in 1958, and notice the repeated reference to impressions, to be understood in contrast to an expression-based aesthetic. So it's a poetics of effect, of control over the audience. Our cabaret will not be, as one could misunderstand it, as disguise for measures to be taken, such as, for instance, moral exhortations, but pure event. We will have no criticism to make, no protest to express, except for an articulate criticism of our specific audience, a protest against its passive way of being a spectator, against its reactions so easy to control, reaction that we, confidentially speaking, will provoke in any case with our means. They were impertinent. Our cabaret will consist of the set of impressions that can appeal to our guests. If we intend to educate the audience, it is only to broaden the range of its perceptions, to integrate impressions, manage complex associations of ideas. Our cabaret will be exactly what every individual can take home in terms of impressions. Everything as a role: the floor, the seat neighbor, the wardrobe attendant. Our actors will not give the illusion of being other people, like Stanislavski's actors, and will not even signify them, like Brecht's actors. They remain themselves. Nonetheless, the audience will fall into the illusion of a representation. This is wrong and intentional. So, in order to understand the character of such poetics of control, it might be useful to compare it with a literary project that came straight from an actual cyberneticist. It is indeed, this is a peculiar fact, but several eminent cyberneticists cultivated artistic ambitions. So it's another sign of impertinence, you see. So Warren McCulloch, the very stern Warren McCulloch, and Stafford Beer, for instance, wrote and published poems. And then Gordon Pask, whom I mentioned, in 1964, he drafted a proposal for a cybernetic theater. He wanted each spectator to be equipped with headphones, control panels, to choose a dramatist persona with which to identify, and to vote for the desired course of action. Each time the piece would present a set of possible alternatives, like the choose your own adventure books, or with this arborescent structure, which was then used also by Raymond Queneau and so on. So vote results will be transmitted to the actors in real time through a set of color lights mounted on stage. And there will be pauses during the play so that designated prompters could inform you over the headphones on the unspoken intentions, the sentiments of the hero you selected. So, majority wins. The psychology of persona is scripted and predetermined by a meta-informative input. And, you have this audience plus actors plus author, which are considered as a closed system in communicative symbiosis. The aesthetic novelty, what is the aesthetic novelty? It's for the most in this circular cooperation, because everybody gratifies everyone else. My expectations are gratified, I applaud, and then the actors are gratified, and the author is happy. You see, this is one idea of feedback and Pavlov. And in contrast, the experiments of the Vienna group have a very antagonistic, rather despotic disposition towards the audience, whose expectations are considered completely sterile. The expectations of the audience are what needs to be done away with. The possibility of liberating a productive learning process lies in the expansion of the aesthetic experience towards reality, in a sort of complication towards the environment. So the stimulus-reaction mechanism is not a means to improving an aesthetic object, but it becomes part of it. Yeah. Today, I mentioned in my class with Eric here the futurists reacting to the throw of vegetables at them by just standing on podium and smoking. Of course, that makes it into part of the piece right away. It's a similar situation here. So, to this poetics, now we have these 2 points: impertinence and control, and I will add, as a third siren of cybernetics, a poetics of reduction. reduction, we need to unpack this concept. It has, I mean it in various shapes and forms. So the cybernetic equivalence of organism and machine allow to illustrate complex notions through clear analogies without resorting to the castle of transcendental abstractions. In the general theory of systems outlined by the Austrian theoretician Ludwig von Bertalanffy, the metaphysical notions of vitalism and finalism are substituted by a simple principle of conservation. The teleology of an organism becomes something that is sharply defined and reducible, here the reduction, to a behavior ruled by feedback. And Wiener, in his book, praises this reduction. He acknowledges as a merit of cybernetics the elimination of an irrational residuum which was still lingering in the notion of organism. But my referring to reduction is not just about a reduction of abstract concepts and to a turn against the metaphysical tradition, let's say towards materialism, but it's also an attention to mechanical material aspects of communication and language. Claude Shannon's famous research for the Bell Labs, aimed at finding a statistical measure for messages, was conducted by reducing messages to their simple physical properties. Even before then, Russian mathematician Andrei Markov had already arrived at his theory of probabilistic chains by tabulating Pushkin's Evgeny Onegin and by reducing the most sacred Russian poem to a series of binomial choices. The results that came out from such reductive treatments of a text with utter deliberate neglect for its meaning revealed how some generative processes were ruled by probability rather than by the author's hand, thus opening the way for the exploration of hidden structures which existed independently from the writer's intention and awareness, but which could nonetheless give us new ways of looking at the text and its style, its organization. Shannon and his theory of information, which are quoted several times in the improvement of Central Europe, although mostly in a critical way, are also, as I think, part of a landscape that Wiener explored and had in mind as he, solo or with his friends Konrad Bayer and Gerhard Röhm, experimented with small word constellations, with mechanical text, with poems involving permutation, seriality, Fibonacci series, and so on. So at the same time, here I think it's important to highlight some aspects that distinguish the experimental approach of the Vienna group and of Wiener in particular. First, the corruption of procedures. So in the text machines of Oswald Wiener and Konrad Bayer, there is always some kind of bug, some capricious swerve between algorithm and execution, some man-made incident, a lapse of the hand. There is a study by Janet Boatin about Konrad Bayer that highlights very much this kind of anti-cybernetic type of cybernetic of the Vienna group. So unlike in other early machine texts, like those of Theo Lutz, for instance, there is no exact correspondence between the compositional plan and the final text. Second, and this is particularly the case for Wiener, the goal of such violation of rules is not simply an anti-deterministic affirmation. Here, think for a moment about the Oulipo experimental group. A few years later, the Oulipo group would later classify such deliberate contravention of the rules that they were self-imposing on their own text. They called it klinamen, and of course they adopted the terminology, the Epicurean terminology for the swerve of the atom. So this klinamen was meant to reaffirm the role of the author, its ultimate effect on the text, its agency. So I decide, and so on. And so Wiener, of course, is the master autocrat. I mean, this is an autocratic text by any means. But what Wiener considers ultimately important is a reflection about the effect that both the text machine and the irregularity have on the subject. So ideally the error, the irregularity should focally trigger a point of access into some basic cognitive mechanism. So we go always back to this attempt really of getting more insights in the quality of our thinking. So in other words, literary machines, text generating formulae, do not find here the raison d'être simply by the fact that they are productive which they are by definition also. So but for Wiener, they need to be put in front of the subjective experience. We ought to ask ourselves, what is it like to use them? What do they do that we don't, and vice versa? Third point, Wiener emphasizes repeatedly the limits of applicability of Shannon's theory. I should say, actually, that Shannon himself emphasized the limits of applicability of his own theory, because Shannon repeatedly warns the reader that his special usage of the terms information and message completely exclude the semantic aspect. So his theory is not about meaning. And here, according to Wiener, one person who did not hear that warning committed a fatal mistake, and that person was Max Bense. Bense's aesthetical theory of information had arbitrarily expanded the use of statistical principles by applying them to content and meaning. Wiener thought that with such expanded statistical approach, aesthetics would no longer be a tool for explaining mental processes and cognition. And here, the worst result of Bense's influence, and Bense was influential. That's, this is a name that frequently comes up in the context of art and cybernetics, early computer poetry, even now in conjunction with conceptual writing, etc. So the worst result, according to Wiener, is the diffusion of a behavioristic belief on the intrinsic meaning of chains of signs. So this is hardcore cybernetics, a prescribed reality of signs that is treated as meaningful. So regardless of who utters them. So, this kind of library of Babel unfolding in front of your eyes, and this kind of discourse that carries on by itself, completely detached from its speakers, speakers who, on their own end, contribute to their own exclusion by believing that meaning is in and of itself a property of the signs contained in the written signs. This is something that Wiener is radically opposed to. And this last point could actually well summarize one main reason for Wiener's distancing from cybernetics. There is a last reduction we need to consider. We said that cybernetics belongs to a broader history of formalization of knowledge. This formalization was promoted in the 20th century by scientific programs which had strong ambitions of completeness, so the axiomatic method in mathematics, logical positivism in philosophy, and precisely the cybernetic systems theory, which then turned into the AI paradigm, etc. So it's a lineup of calculation, formalization, mechanization, quite deterministic. It's like a second sky of astral planets, conjunctions. So the landscape advanced by formalism is, however, profoundly different than the skyscape, etc. And it's profoundly different from the landscape of our common mental objects, our mental representations, how did you translate Vorstellungen?
Proxy objects.
Our proxy objects, right? Which they seem to us as being still congruent with the causality of the physical world. A formal system must only offer congruence with the logic of its own production rules, not with the physical world. So throughout his life, Wiener has spent lots of time reflecting on the relationship between our mental processes on the one hand and formal languages on the other. He thought that the way we make sense of the world, our perceiving something as meaningful, basically sense itself, was our biologically funded alternative to formalisms. So instead of a reality reduced to formulae, here I come again to the reduction, we experience a continuous emergence of connections and analogies with a distinct flavor of the meaningful. So this is more attuned to our skills, that is, to our limited formal computational capacity, and more reliant on our ability of operating on the basis of distinguishable qualities that we acknowledge precisely as meaningful. Now, if sense is our expedient to overcome the limits of our formal capacity, what happens to sense when you have the formula? Well, sense, the way we have just outlined it, is no longer needed. It kind of evaporates. You have the formula is the formalized alternative to your sensual representations, so you have the formula, the sense goes away. So this means that the advance of formal explanations of our physical, possibly even of our mental world, would imply a simultaneous retreat of sense, an evaporation of meaning. Or, this is an alternative, is there sense in a formal landscape, outside of our regular experience, outside of language and representation? Is there sense in a formal landscape? This is like I've spoken for very long, so I think I can leave you with this. It's a typical Oswald Wiener question, and I think I'm done with that. Thank you. So I'm asking my dear friends and dear audience, so charming and patient, should we continue with the Q&A if you still have the stamina, or curiosities or questions to any of us, and then we'll try and
Well, I was talking with Ellen on the way here. We were very impressed by the work. And she said it's really impressive that this work of radical contestation produced in the late 60s is one of the last works of radical contestation of the order of things and the way society makes meaning, which has no reference to feminism. So my question is, what happens if we put together the poetics of Wiener with what people would do right now? Because many of us are unable to think of a time when this contestation will happen without thinking about queer thinking, feminism, and so on. So let's try to follow Wiener's provocative spirit. What happens?
Well, there is a whole section of the book where he turns into a woman. This is already something, right? And it's called Fundaments of an Experimental Past. So he gives himself a past as a woman, and he imagines to undergo. It's like a pre-bioadapter experience. I can also tell you that one of the people that supported Wiener, collaborated with him, was a key figure in Austrian feminism, particularly of the use of art for putting feminism at the center stage, which is Vali Export. Vali Export made a movie with Oswald Wiener and Ingrid Wiener, made a movie about Oswald Wiener. Vali Export also, as Thomas Eder told me, requested a copy of my book, so I felt like I should mention it. But I don't know. I think that there is that section there, and also one thing to remember is that this book is not just not going with feminism, is not going with Marxism, is not going with youth movements. This is like. Really like Giordano Bruno's expulsion of the triumphant beast is a purge. This book is written also against the determination that the author felt could interfere with his tabula rasa. It's really a movement out of the author, and it's absolutely asocial. It does not try to build any type of bridges or coalitions. It is born out of a deep, tough asociality, hard to digest, definitely. It's, this is a book that elects Stirner as one of the fellow voices that can resonate, precisely because the author knew that, thinking of the Marxist mainstream, the diffusion of mainstream masculine, Stirner is kind of the problematic figure for Marx. Marx cannot make sense of the asociality of Stirner, doesn't quite know how to deal with it. And so I think this is a way by Oswald Wiener to signal that he's really not, he doesn't find voices in the official youth movements of that moment that could just channel what he has to say. It's really born out of a certain distance and rage against the war. It's a solo. It's a solo which then kind of dissolves into a myriad of work. It's a solo.
So the language very genitals, all part of the bodies.
Yeah, there are lots of
Everything
similarities.
is very man-related, isn't it? This is my impression.
I think that this is a really interesting branch of thinking, as what you said before, that this kind of raging against each and every philosophies or whatever history had to offer its Marxism. On the other hand, Marxism does play a role, but is downplayed to some degree with its role. And what had happened if this here in this book, with this stance of downplaying and denouncing things, had taken up feminism? How could he have taken up feminism in a way which is not downplaying it, because everything is to be downplayed in this book to some degree. And there is, besides this passage that you quoted, there is one single page which is kind of enigmatic, which with only one sentence written to it, which has written in German, alle Menschen sollten gute Freundinnen sein.
Al mondo dovrebbero tutti essere buone amiche, he says. And then, speaking of the fact that it's really a raging purge even against the models that he liked. He likes 1,000 Baptisms, Baptisms 1,000, etc. But this one, I recollect one single literary figure that is treated well, and that is Gertrude Schoen. She is the absolute exception. There is like a scene with her in Knights. She's Midas. Everything she touches becomes gold. She's silent as an authority.
I have to say at first that I did not read your book, as you know. I refused immediately because I worked on, of course, a lot on avant-garde, Zerbound, all the movements of, I would say, between the 10 and the 50s. What I have to say now is a question, but at first I found that it's a kind of parody of what has been already done in some ways, not for cybernetics, of course, but the elimination of the meaning, for instance, of semantic. This has been a great page of 20th century first art until the 60s. Okay? And so my question is, in some ways, that movement, those movements, Vorticism, for instance, I don't speak about futurism so much, Vorticism, Imagism, all the things which happened in the first part of the century, the 20th century, were in some ways determined by the relationship with science. For what I have understood from Professor Eder and from you, the relationship with science, between science and language, which was crucial for them, now is in some ways reiterated, in some ways deleted. So this is something I would like to understand better, because in my opinion it is foundational.
It's foundation.
Foundation, yes. So this is...
Yes, sure.
So I would say that in the time
Would you
of
please,
writing,
thank you.
In the time when writing the improvement, Wiener over-exaggerated the point that the individual is to a very large degree controlled by outer means, by which have their roots in the philosophy of behaviorism, and the means and the medium for these outer media, it's kind of paradoxical, was at this time language for him. At this time, when writing the Verbesserung, Wiener over-exaggerated that point, later doing away with this notion and this concept and just saying that language is not that important. Language is something which is a kind of mnemonic for thought processes, an encapsulated module. We have this kind of impressionist art impression. You have to project your own intentions, your own feelings, your own emotions onto the surface of language which comes back to you. But later on in his work, and this was quite close to the end, in 2021, he returned to some degree to an interview he read then by Noam Chomsky, where Noam Chomsky, for the first time in Wiener's definition or in Wiener's reading, somewhat altered his own position when he said that it's about communicating efficiently is not the important thing. It's about calculating efficiently. So if you have say ambiguities, visiting relatives can be a nuisance. You have both things. Is it about the communicating? It's rather the externalization is rather bad, but internally you do it. It works brilliantly. And this is what Chomsky said in this interview, that this is the kind where was the big jump in the evolution of mankind. Few thousand years ago, when it came to this kind of change, that you had this point of calculating efficiently, and the externalization, which is language, definitely, externalization is not that important, and this is where we know
that language does not serve for communicating. This is the theory of linguistics today. Okay, so just one thing, I don't want to insist too much on that. One is, do you have any idea that he was in some ways related to Leibniz for this? You have used this word calculation. Yes. So this is a spy, in my opinion, of something which could preside over his work. I have to say, I think that at this point I have to read your book. However, I have a refutation now for everything which is avant-garde in my life. I am now extremely conservative. But I have been in the past highly.
But then, in that piece, Purim, he's just beating up all the audience that shows up for an avant-garde event. It's like this imaginary piece. It's just a revenge against this type of, society of spectacle that is now swallowing avant-garde as well.
The other thing, can be calculation related to the deleting of meaning because numbers enter to deal relations? Yes or no? Maybe.
This is a bit what I was trying to convey with the idea of the meaning of formalisms, right? So once you enter, Wiener loved to quote an essay written in the 70s by a French mathematician named Dieudonné, who was concerned about meaning in formalism. He thought, we are used to certain type of representations that are more attuned to our ecology, to our biological. But so what happens in the case of specialists, people who are, used to operate with symbols like mathematicians, logicians, cyberneticists, and Oswald Wiener, because he's Austrian, he would add bureaucrats, of course, also. The bureaucracy here in this book is being insulted as really the foot soldiers of formalism. Formalism has these great directions like logical positivism, etc. And then it has also the foot soldiers, the ones who do the dirty battles. They operate with symbol at a much more trivial level. But now, so Dieudonné was thinking about it, and he was saying, at some point, there is this process of evaporation, like you have the formula and something vanishes. But then when you get accustomed more and more to a landscape, he says something about on se reconnaît dans un pays d'habitude. So more or less this is like the verbatim translation. So we start getting to know the landscape, and then there is something similar that happens with what I try to describe with sense or meaning. So this premonition of a fruitful combination. So the sense of two things connected because the connection might be fruitful. The sense that something has content because it kind of clicks. And so this is something that occupied Wiener constantly, this difference between the way of thinking operating with symbols. He was proficient in mathematics, so he knew, and he was a programmer. So
what you are saying reminds me something. The idea, I think, according to what you said, is that instead of meaning in the sense we used to use, there is a logical relations, which does not imply a meaning, but the linear plan that is created. I wanted to read the prose of your translation to understand. Of course, I don't know.
Well, the first part deals
German.
with the tractatus, right? So
But in some ways, Vorticism was looking for replacing meanings with mathematics. And another question I finish, I go, is what's the meaning? What's someone, I don't remember if the professor Eder or you spoke about what is poetry. Poetry, yes. Someone said that poetry or poems, no?
No, I try to
okay.
talk about poetics. Poetics
Yeah,
of
okay.
impertinence, poetics of... I try to define in these three ways the fascination with cybernetics in terms of poetics of impertinence, poetics of control, and the poetics of reduction. It was not that.
Poetics, no poetry. There is no discourse on poetry, no.
No, I mean, not today, but maybe next time.
No, in the book.
But I wanted to tell you my final take on this whole, language, linguistic turn, etc. So, when Wiener, in his formative years, really, you understand this linguistic turn was absolutely central. So, he was, the first 50, 60 pages are all really written with the Tractatus in mind. Actually contesting this perfect alignment between a logical order and an order of facts, of Sachverhalte and so on. But I think there are two possible ways of looking at Wiener's arch, the career, so to speak. One is to say, okay, he was obsessed with being determined by language. He wrote this book which transformed him. This is kind of a Bildungsroman because you have this transformative process. Really, at the end of the novel, he realizes, but the metaphor, the machine metaphor is way larger. It's way more important than the language metaphor. So this idea of language as a possible behavioristic pendant to thought is nothing compared to what's coming now with the machine. So the machine metaphor somehow swallows the language metaphor. So you can say Wiener's career is about curing himself from this obsession of language and just then giving less importance to language. Or I propose perhaps a slightly different take. Perhaps it was always about trying to look at where is thought other than in language, and trying to push away thought from language and make language less important. First, in this book, you have this attempt of showing moments where the language doesn't work, but the story works. Why? Because it's like an attempt of accounting for mental activity, even in completely pathetic moments where the tongue doesn't work, but you understand what's going on through the fact that there is like an atmosphere. So this book is kind of pushing thought away from language by going towards mentalism, a little bit below language if you want, and a little bit on the side of language through pragmatics. Thomas wrote a great essay about the connections between Wiener, sometimes the anticipations, and pragmatic aspect of linguistics. So all the gesture, all the things around the language that still enable us to make meaning out of the situation. And then later on in his career, he moved to a different type of reconsideration of meaning, trying to reflect on meaning in mental models, meaning in possible, meaning in formal systems, perhaps not. But you see, overall then, it's a more cogent arc that is all about essentially trying to relocate cognition a little away from language. So I don't read this book as, a monument on language determinism, quite the opposite.
Okay, so just one thing, the last really is a technique, because you said
I said.
the asset technique. My students know that this is one of my topics, technique.
I know.
And we know that it has been demonized, I think, in terms of Severino. I'm talking of the 70s. But for instance, for the avant-garde of Pound, other people, it was extremely important. We know that it starts with Plato and continues with Aristotle and Aristotelianism. But my question is, according to what you have said, I understand that the technique for Wiener should be extremely important. You said that he was ambiguous.
No, he says, it has, he says essentially, of course, we can go towards distraction. It's going to happen, so we are, but there are, first of all, heuristic, aspects of it that are helpful for heuristic purposes. So the technical imagination really helps you visualize, help you see cognition in a way. That's the ultimate ambition of a technical imagination, to make knowledge visible. I'm just using now Renaissance terminology of Lina Bolzoni. But so, on the one hand, there is this heuristic value of technique, and on the other hand, it is an upsetting force. So, if you think that there are certain things that ought to change, technique is good. It could give us, for instance, instead of one reality that is controlled and compact through cybernetic control, many realities. And he didn't live in the present time, but back then he thought that might be interesting. So,
just to continue what you were saying, or to add on with Leibniz thing, and with the numbers and with the mathematics that Wiener often quoted, and this is maybe at the center of his, going back to Leibniz, this kind of syntaxis, like parroting. The parroting.
Psittacismo.
Psittacismo within Leibniz, where it is, Leibniz himself says that you can have you can employ signs as if they were completely without meaning. Then you parrot only. You only talk like a parrot, and this is like calculating in the realm of algebra without having any idea or proxy object of this geometric foundation of this algebra. And if you only do algebra, you are like the talking syntaxist.
Un pappagallo. Un pappagallo dei segni, in sostanza.
Yeah.
Cioè,
and so this is what Wiener was many of his writings and later work. He thought of this kind of syntaxism or pappagallo as the symbols of informatics or computation. The symbols in computation are by definition without any meaning.
the machine doesn't
Doesn't, yeah.
clusters.
And using language might be in some way to this propaganda. On the other hand, it might be what I was trying to say before with Chomsky on this calculating efficiently inside ambiguities, for example. Externalization is maybe different.
Grazie Maria Luisa, grazie. No further questions, then I'd say we say thank you to our guests and thank you, Thomas and Nicola, for assisting me.